The chair sat at the foot of the table every Thanksgiving, exactly the way it had sat there for as long as Miriam Calder could remember. A plain wooden chair, unmatched to the others, with no place setting in front of it, no plate, no napkin, simply present and empty amid the noise and steam of a table otherwise crowded with 3 generations of family. Nobody sat in it. Nobody had ever sat in it, not once, in Miriam's entire life. And Miriam had never once, in 43 years, seriously questioned why. This year, it was her 6-year-old niece, Poppy, who finally asked, "Why is that chair always empty?" Poppy said loudly in the specific unfiltered way of small children who haven't yet learned which questions a room has silently agreed never to ask, pointing directly at the chair as the whole table momentarily stilled around her. Miriam watched her father, Elias, 78 now, pause with his fork halfway to his mouth, his expression settling into the same brief, practiced deflection Miriam had witnessed her entire life without ever once examining it closely. "That's just how we've always done it, sweetheart," Elias said, his voice light, already turning back toward his plate. "Family tradition. Eat your dinner." Poppy, satisfied by the tone if not the actual content of the answer, returned to her mashed potatoes. The table's ordinary noise resumed, the moment passing as quickly and as thoroughly as it always had. Every year, whenever some new, younger member of the family noticed the chair for the first time and asked the same obvious question and received the same practiced, unsatisfying non-answer in return, Miriam sat with her own fork suspended for a moment longer than the rest of the table, looking at the empty chair, and felt something she hadn't quite felt before in the presence of that familiar, unremarkable piece of furniture, the specific, uncomfortable recognition that she did not actually know the answer either. She had grown up inside this ritual so completely that she had never once thought to interrogate it. The chair was simply part of the architecture of every family gathering, as fixed and unquestioned as the tablecloth, as the specific order in which the family said grace, as the seat her father always took at the head of the table. She understood vaguely that it was connected to something old, a story from before her own memory, something about a relative who had never arrived or never returned, the details soft and unfixed in her mind the way distant family lore often becomes after passing through several generations of retelling. She looked at her father, still eating, apparently unbothered by a question he had deflected 100 times before, and understood, with a small private jolt, that even he might not actually know the full story, that somewhere across a century of Thanksgiving dinners, the specific truth behind the empty chair had quietly worn away, leaving only the shape of the ritual behind, faithfully repeated by people who no longer remembered exactly what it had originally been built to hold. Miriam Calder was 43 years old, an archivist at the Regional Historical Society, a profession she had drifted into after a graduate degree in library science that her family had always considered, with a mixture of affection and mild bewilderment, a slightly eccentric choice, spending her professional life organizing and preserving other families' documents, letters, photographs, and records, the careful custodian of thousands of strangers' pasts. She had never applied the same careful professional curiosity to her own family's history, a fact that struck her in the days following that Thanksgiving dinner with a specific and uncomfortable irony. She was unmarried, though not by any particular unhappiness with that arrangement, living alone in a small apartment not far from the archive where she worked, close enough to her father's house that she visited most weeks, close enough to the rest of her extended family that holidays and birthdays remained a consistent, if sometimes exhausting, feature of her calendar. She had a younger brother, Colin, from whom she had been quietly, unofficially estranged for 3 years, a rift that had begun during their mother's final illness, when disagreements over care decisions and, later, the modest inheritance that followed her death had calcified into a series of increasingly clipped, infrequent conversations that had eventually stopped altogether, neither of them ever explicitly deciding to end contact, simply drifting further apart with each missed holiday, each unreturned message, until the silence itself had become its own kind of unspoken agreement. Miriam told herself when she thought about Colin at all that the rift wasn't really her responsibility to repair, that he had said things during their mother's illness that had hurt her deeply, that if he wanted to reconcile, he knew how to reach her, that she had done nothing wrong by simply allowing the natural consequence of his behavior to play out. This explanation held up reasonably well most days. On other days, usually during family gatherings where his absence was quietly, carefully not discussed, it held up considerably less well. Her father, Elias, had inherited the empty chair tradition from his own parents, who had, in turn, inherited it from further back still, a family ritual stretching back, as far as anyone currently living could confirm, to the family's original immigration to the United States sometime in the early 20th century. Elias had explained it to Miriam once, when she was young, in vague and incomplete terms, that the chair was for someone who might, someday, come back. He had never specified who exactly, or from where, or why the family had continued the tradition for what was apparently, by that point, already several generations. Miriam had absorbed this explanation the way children absorb most inherited family customs, without particular scrutiny, simply as one of the unremarkable fixed points of her family's identity, alongside her grandmother's recipe for holiday stuffing and the specific, slightly superstitious way her father always knocked twice on wood after mentioning good fortune aloud. She had never once, in 43 years, thought to apply her professional skills, the careful, methodical research she performed daily for other families' histories, to her own family's oldest and most persistent unexplained ritual. Poppy's question, delivered with the specific unguarded directness only a 6-year-old could manage, had lodged itself somewhere in Miriam's chest in the days following Thanksgiving, refusing to dislodge, growing instead into a specific, insistent curiosity she found herself unable to set aside. Miriam visited her father the following weekend, not for their usual casual Sunday check-in, but with a specific purpose she found herself slightly nervous articulating. "I want to know the real story," she told him, sitting across from him at his kitchen table, the same table, in a different house, where the empty chair tradition had presumably been observed for decades before Elias had eventually inherited both the house and the ritual from his own parents. "About the chair, not the version we give the kids. What do you actually know?" Elias was quiet for a moment, setting down his coffee cup with the particular care of someone deciding how much of a long, uncertain story he actually had the confidence to tell accurately. "Not as much as I probably should," he admitted finally. "My grandmother told me, when I was maybe 10 years old, that the chair was for her husband's younger brother, a man named Tobias. She said the family, my great-grandparents, and their children, including my grandfather, came over from Europe together sometime around 1911, and Tobias was supposed to come with them. Something happened, and he didn't make the ship. I don't know the specifics. I don't think my grandmother knew all the specifics either. Honestly, I think by the time she was telling me, the story had already passed through enough retellings that some of the detail had simply worn away." "Did they ever find out what happened to him?" Miriam asked. Elias shook his head slowly. "As far as I know, no. My grandmother said the family never heard from him again after that. She said her mother-in-law, Tobias's mother, I suppose, my great-great-grandmother, started the tradition of leaving a chair empty at every holiday meal in case he ever found his way to them after all. She said it started as an actual, genuine hope, not just a ritual. And then, as the years passed and he never came, it just stayed. Nobody in the family ever felt right about being the one to finally stop doing it." Miriam sat with this for a long moment, feeling the specific, complicated grief of a story that had apparently been quietly diminishing, generation by generation, from a raw and desperate hope into an inherited habit whose original weight nobody currently living had ever actually felt. "I want to find out what really happened to him," she said finally. "I think I have the skills to actually do it properly. I don't know why it's never occurred to me before." Elias looked at her for a long moment, something moving across his face that Miriam found difficult to fully read. Curiosity, certainly, but also something more hesitant, more uncertain. "What if you find something we don't want to know?" he asked. "What if the answer is worse than not knowing at all?" Miriam considered this seriously. "I think I'd still rather know," she said. "I think 100 years of not knowing has already cost this family something, even if none of us have ever fully named what that cost actually was." Miriam began her research the following week, applying the full weight of her professional training to a search that felt, for the first time in her career, genuinely, personally urgent. She started with the ship manifests from the family's known immigration year, searching through digitized records from the port where her family had reportedly arrived, cross-referencing the Calder surname against passenger lists from the specific months her father had mentioned. She found the family relatively quickly, her great-great-grandparents and their 4 listed children, arriving on a vessel in the autumn of 1911, exactly as the family lore had always described. Tobias Calder's name did not appear among them. She widened her search, checking manifests from ships departing the same European port in the weeks before and after her family's confirmed crossing, understanding that if Tobias had genuinely missed the original departure, he might have attempted to follow on a later vessel. It took her nearly 2 weeks of careful, methodical searching, working late most evenings at the archive after her regular hours, before she found a promising match. A passenger listed as Tobias Calder, the surname spelled with a K rather than a C, arriving nearly 6 weeks after her own direct ancestors, on a different ship, alone, with no family members listed alongside him. The spelling discrepancy, Miriam knew from years of professional experience, was hardly unusual. Immigration clerks of the era frequently misspelled names phonetically, especially for passengers whose accents or handwriting made the intended spelling ambiguous. She felt a specific, rising excitement at the possibility that she had found the actual thread of what happened to her family's long-lost relative, immediately followed by the sobering understanding that a name on a manifest told her almost nothing about what had actually happened to the man attached to it once he arrived. She told her closest friend, Renata, about the discovery over dinner that week. Watching Renata's expression shift from interest into something more concerned as Miriam described the growing scope of her research, the late nights at the archive, the weekends spent combing through digitized newspaper databases, the specific, consuming intensity with which she had thrown herself into the project over the preceding month. "I think you might be doing the thing you always do," Renata said carefully, once Miriam had finished describing her latest findings. "Throwing yourself completely into someone else's unresolved story instead of dealing with the one sitting right in front of you." Miriam looked at her, genuinely puzzled for a moment. "What do you mean?" "Colin," Renata said simply, "you haven't spoken to your own brother in 3 years, and you're spending every free hour of your life right now trying to solve a 100-year-old mystery about a great-great-great-uncle you never met. I'm not saying the research isn't meaningful. I just think it's worth asking yourself honestly why this particular unresolved family rift feels safer to work on than the one that's actually still fixable." Miriam sat with this observation longer than she wanted to admit, recognizing, with the specific discomfort of hearing an accurate thing said plainly, that Renata had identified something Miriam herself had been carefully avoiding examining, that pursuing Tobias's century-old disappearance required nothing of her except diligent research, while reaching out to Colin required something considerably harder: the risk of vulnerability, of apology, of a conversation whose outcome she couldn't control through careful methodology alone. "I'll think about it," Miriam said, which both of them understood, in the specific shorthand of a long friendship, to mean she wasn't ready to think about it yet. Miriam's research into Tobias Calder stalled for several weeks after the initial ship manifest discovery, the trail going cold once she attempted to trace what had happened to him after his arrival in America. She found no further immigration records under either spelling of the surname, no obvious census entries, no newspaper mentions that seemed to match. She considered, during the stalled period, submitting a DNA sample to one of the genealogy testing services that had become, over the preceding decade, an increasingly common tool for exactly this kind of search, a modern method for locating living relatives descended from branches of a family tree that traditional documentary research had lost track of. She hesitated for nearly 3 weeks before actually ordering the kit, recognizing, uncomfortably, the same pattern of avoidance Renata had named weeks earlier, a specific reluctance to take the one action most likely to actually produce a real human answer in favor of continuing the safer, more controllable work of searching archives that couldn't talk back. She finally submitted the sample on a Sunday evening, mailing it the following morning, and then, in the weeks of waiting that followed, found herself thinking, more than once, about Colin, about the specific parallel between her own 3 years of comfortable, unexamined silence and the family's century of quietly maintaining a ritual for a relative nobody had ever actually tried hard enough to find. The DNA results arrived 9 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, with a notification that made Miriam's breath catch the moment she opened it. A strong genetic match, identified as a likely third or fourth cousin, a woman named Dahlia Calder Whitmore, living in a state Miriam had never visited, on the opposite side of the country from where the Calder family had settled after their 1911 arrival. Miriam sat with the notification for a long time before she made herself send an introductory message, explaining, as clearly and carefully as she could manage, the specific family mystery that had led her to the testing service in the first place. Dahlia's response arrived the following morning, considerably longer and more detailed than Miriam had expected. "I think I might know exactly who you're looking for," Dahlia wrote. "My great-great-grandfather was named Tobias Calder. Family stories always said he arrived alone, as a young man, sometime in the early 1900s, and that he never spoke much about the family he'd left behind in Europe, only that there had been some kind of separation during the crossing that he was never able to properly resolve. He built an entire life here, married, had 5 children, worked as a carpenter for over 40 years. He died in 1958. I never knew him myself, but my grandmother, his daughter, used to say he carried a particular sadness his whole life that nobody in the family ever fully understood, connected somehow to whatever happened during that original crossing." Miriam and Dahlia exchanged messages nearly every day over the following weeks, gradually piecing together, from both sides of a century-old separation, the fuller shape of what had actually happened to Tobias Calder in the autumn of 1911. Working from an old family Bible Dahlia's branch had preserved, along with a handful of letters and documents passed down across 4 generations, they were able to reconstruct a version of events considerably more specific than the vague family lore either side had inherited. Tobias, the youngest of the Calder siblings, had stayed behind at the last moment before the family's original departure to care for a family friend who had fallen seriously ill just days before the ship was scheduled to sail. A decision made quickly, under pressure, with the understanding, shared by everyone involved, that Tobias would follow on the next available crossing once the friend's condition stabilized or resolved. The friend had died 3 weeks later. By the time Tobias was finally able to book passage on a delayed and considerably more circuitous route, the specific address his family had intended to settle at in America had changed, a detail Miriam confirmed through her own family's records, showing that her great-great-grandparents had relocated within their first 2 months in the country, following an unexpected opportunity for work in a different city than originally planned. Tobias had arrived, alone, to an address that no longer held his family, in a country whose systems for tracking and reconnecting separated immigrants were, in 1911, rudimentary at best. He had written letters, according to a fragment preserved in Dahlia's family Bible, to the only address he had, letters that, Miriam's own research confirmed, would have arrived at a residence the family had already vacated, likely returned to sender or simply discarded by whatever new occupants had taken over the property. He had spent, according to Dahlia's family stories, nearly 2 years attempting various methods to relocate his family before eventually, painfully, accepting that the separation might be permanent. He had settled in the city, where his ship had ultimately arrived, built a life, married, and, according to Dahlia's grandmother's account, rarely spoke of the family he'd lost track of, except in specific private moments of sadness that none of his own children had ever fully understood the source of. "I think he never stopped hoping quietly," Dahlia wrote in one of her later messages. "My grandmother said he used to set an extra place at their own holiday table sometimes, when she was very young, just once or twice a year, without explanation, and then eventually he stopped doing it, and she always assumed he'd simply given up hoping his birth family might somehow find him." Miriam read this passage with tears she didn't try to stop, understanding, with a grief that felt both historical and immediate, that both branches of a single family had apparently spent decades independently maintaining some version of the same quiet, hopeful gesture. An empty chair, an extra place setting, each side entirely unaware that the other existed, each side keeping a door open for a reunion that circumstance and the specific limitations of an earlier century's communication had made effectively impossible. Miriam told her father everything on a Sunday evening, several weeks after her first exchange with Dahlia, laying out the full reconstructed story across his kitchen table with the careful, methodical clarity she brought to her professional work. Elias listened without interrupting, his expression moving slowly through several stages: confusion, then grief, then something that looked, by the end, almost like relief. "So he wasn't lost at sea," Elias said finally, his voice unsteady. "He wasn't turned away. He made it. He just lost us, and we lost him. Not through anyone's fault, exactly, just through bad timing and an address that changed at the wrong moment. He tried to find us," Miriam said quietly, "for years apparently, and it sounds like some part of him never fully stopped hoping, even after he built a whole separate life. His descendants exist, Dad, a whole branch of the family we've never known about. Dahlia has children. There are people alive right now who share our exact same great-great-grandparents, and none of us have ever known they existed." Elias sat with this for a long moment, looking toward his own kitchen, where the family's version of the ritual chair, inherited, like the house itself, from his parents, currently sat in storage between holidays. "I don't know what to do with this," he admitted. 100 years of leaving that chair empty, and now I know exactly who it was for, and exactly what happened to him, and I don't know if that makes the tradition feel more meaningful, or if it makes it feel like something we should finally be allowed to let go of. "Maybe it doesn't have to be one or the other," Miriam said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke it aloud for the first time. "Maybe we don't have to choose between keeping the chair exactly the way it's always been or getting rid of it entirely. Maybe there's a third option, something that actually honors what really happened instead of just repeating a ritual nobody fully understood anymore." "What would that look like?" Elias asked. Miriam thought about Dahlia, 4 states away, and the whole unknown branch of family that had spent decades unaware of their connection to the Calders. She thought, too, about Colin and the specific, familiar shape of her own 3 years of comfortable, unexamined silence. "I think it might mean finally inviting someone to sit in it," she said, "instead of leaving it empty forever, in case someone shows up who never will. I think it might mean finding the people who actually can show up now, even if it's 100 years later than anyone originally hoped." Miriam called Colin 2 days later, her hands unsteady in a way that embarrassed her slightly, understanding, as she dialed, that she was finally taking the one action she had spent 3 years, and, more recently, an entire month of consuming genealogical research, carefully avoiding. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice cautious, clearly surprised to see her name on his screen after 3 years of silence. "Hi," she said, when the initial awkward pause had stretched long enough that someone needed to break it. "I've been thinking about you. I found out something about our family recently, and it made me realize I don't want to spend the next several decades not talking to you and telling myself it's fine, the way our whole family apparently did with an entire branch of relatives none of us knew existed." Colin was quiet for a moment. "What happened?" Miriam told him the whole story. The chair, Poppy's question, the ship manifests, Tobias, Dahlia, the century of quiet, hopeful, ultimately unresolved waiting that had apparently unfolded on both sides of an ocean, and then, later, both sides of a continent. "I don't want that to be us," she said once she'd finished. "I don't want it to be 30 years from now, and some kid at a holiday table asking why Uncle Colin never comes anymore, and everyone giving some vague, practiced non-answer because the real reason got lost somewhere along the way. I miss you. I think I've been telling myself the distance was your responsibility to fix, because that felt easier than admitting how much I actually wanted to fix it myself." Colin was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an unsteadiness Miriam recognized as matching her own. "I've missed you too," he said. "I think I've been waiting for you to make the first move, telling myself the same story in reverse. I'm sorry about what I said back when Mom was sick. I've regretted it for a long time. I just didn't know how to say so without it feeling too late." "I don't think it's too late," Miriam said. "I think that's actually the whole point of what I just spent a month learning. It's only ever too late if nobody ever tries." Miriam met Dahlia Calder Whitmore in person the following spring, flying out with her father to a small gathering Dahlia had organized at her own home, bringing together, for the first time in over a century, two branches of a single family that had spent generations entirely unaware of each other's existence. The meeting was not without its own specific awkwardness. Two groups of relative strangers, connected by blood and a century-old accident of timing, working to build something like genuine connection out of a shared history none of them had actually lived through personally. But something in the room, Miriam noticed, settled quickly into an ease that surprised her. A specific, unforced warmth that felt less like meeting strangers and more like recognizing, in dozens of small unexpected ways, the particular family resemblances. A laugh, a stubborn set of the jaw, a habit of gesturing while talking that had apparently persisted quietly across 4 generations and 2 entirely separate lives. "I brought something," Elias said, near the end of the visit, producing a photograph he'd carefully packed for the trip, an old formal portrait of the Calder family from shortly before their 1911 departure, the earliest photograph the family possessed. Dahlia studied it for a long moment, her eyes filling. "He looks like my grandfather," she said quietly, pointing to a young man near the edge of the frame. "That same specific way of standing, like he's trying to take up less space than he actually does." They exchanged copies of what documents and photographs each side possessed, filling in, piece by piece, a fuller picture of a man who had spent his whole American life, apparently, quietly wondering what had become of the family he'd lost through nothing more dramatic than bad timing and an unforwarded address. The following Thanksgiving, Miriam's family gathered again at Elias's house. The same table set with the same holiday dishes that had marked every previous gathering across Miriam's entire life. The chair remained at the foot of the table, but this year, for the first time in over a century, it held a place setting, and in the seat beside it, a small framed photograph of Tobias Calder, copied from the portrait Elias had brought to Dahlia's home the previous spring, along with a short, simply worded card explaining, for any child who might ask, exactly who he had been and what had happened to him. Colin sat across from Miriam, having flown in for the holiday for the first time in 4 years, the two of them exchanging an easy, familiar warmth that had taken months of careful, ongoing effort to rebuild, but had, by that Thanksgiving, settled into something that finally felt less like repair and more like simply, ordinarily, family again. Poppy, older now, more capable of holding a longer explanation, asked about the chair again that year, not with the same innocent bewilderment as before, but with genuine curiosity, having apparently absorbed, somewhere in the intervening months, that there was finally a real answer available. "That's for Tobias," Elias told her, gesturing to the small photograph. "He was part of our family, a long time ago, and he got separated from us by accident, and none of us ever got to meet him. We keep his place here now so we remember him, instead of just leaving it empty and hoping." "Did you ever find him?" Poppy asked. "Not him," Elias said gently. "He passed away a long time ago, before any of us were born. But we found his family. They're going to come visit us next year, some of them. So in a way, I think we finally did find him, just later than anyone hoped, and through people instead of through him arriving in person." Poppy considered this with the particular seriousness children sometimes bring to information that matters more than they can fully articulate, and then returned to her dinner, satisfied. The question finally completely answered rather than simply deflected for another year. Miriam looked around the table. Her father, her brother, restored now to something approaching their old closeness. The small photograph of a man none of them had ever met, watching quietly over a holiday dinner he had spent his entire American life hoping, in whatever quiet, private way remained available to him, that he might someday find his way back to. Some chairs, she understood now, stayed empty not because the story was finished, but because nobody had yet done the work of finishing it. And some distances, inherited or chosen, closed not through waiting, but through the specific, deliberate courage of finally deciding to go looking for an answer, for a lost relative, for a brother who had simply been waiting all along for someone to make the first call.